So I assume everyone here knows about Squid Game. It was the hot thing on Netflix a while back, and for good reason. It's pretty damn good. For those unfamiliar, it's the story of desperate people recruited into a series of life or death games for the chance to win an absurd amount of money. Anyway, I found this channel called Foundation for Economic Education. It's a centrist / right-wing channel that has a lot of media critique videos. And boy, I thought to myself, doesn't that sound like it's going to be just terrible? Today, we're going to take a look at their analysis of Squid Game, written by Sean Malone and Jen Mafisatani. Since Sean is the narrator and the producer, he's the only one I'll call out by name. Just a warning, this does contain spoilers for Squid Game, so be aware of that if you still plan on catching up. Squid Game is an explicitly anti-capitalist work. Its own creators have said as much. And so the right-wingers, noticing its popularity, came out in droves to tell us how the creators misunderstand real capitalism. Let's start by looking at Sean's criticisms of the characters. He says that he found most of the cast unsympathetic, particularly the main character, Song Gi-hoon, and that the show as a whole is a distorted and pessimistic depiction of humanity.
Our main character, Gi-hoon, is a divorced, deadbeat dad who has gambling debts he's unable to pay off. He can't even afford to help his mother with rent. He's also stealing from her, by the way.
Well, that definitely sounds pretty bad, which of course it does, because it's the description you'd use if you're only looking at Gi-hoon's negative qualities. But while all the things Sean said are technically true, it's not the full story. From the way he presents it, you'd think Gi-hoon has no compassion for his family, and that they'd all be better off without him. But it's made clear from the first episode that he deeply loves his daughter and wants to be more involved in her life. Unfortunately, his ex-wife's husband doesn't like him and is trying to move them to America, where Gi-hoon will be totally disconnected from her. As for his mom, the two have a close but discordant relationship. She's not some clueless victim unaware of what her son gets up to. Gi-hoon steals from her because his addiction-distorted mind convinces him they'll both be better off once he hits a hot streak, which certainly doesn't excuse it, but it is worth considering when looking at the character holistically. Most importantly, one major factor Sean leaves out of his synopsis is how Gi-hoon becomes the person we meet at the beginning of the story, which is a major part of his character arc. But before looking at that, we have to talk about the real reason Sean hates Gi-hoon.
Almost all of Gi-hoon's problems are self-inflicted. In spite of being reasonably healthy, physically capable, and possessing at least average intelligence, he doesn't do anything remotely productive. He doesn't even try to create value for anybody. Instead, he steals, lies, cheats, and generally doesn't live up to his promises. He mooches off of everyone else and then blames them when things go wrong. The system isn't at fault here. He is.
And there you have it. Gi-hoon is an unproductive bum who offers nothing to society and is undeserving of your sympathy. Gee, wouldn't it be embarrassing for Sean if Gi-hoon had a job for, like, say, I don't know, 10 years? A job that he needed to provide for his newborn daughter, only to lose it due to massive layoffs that were totally out of his control?
맞아. 10년 전쯤인 거야. 자동차 회사에서 큰 파업을 했었어. 그때 뉴스에도 크게 났었던 것 같은데 거기서 사람이 죽었지 않아?
So obviously this would have a traumatic effect on a person, and it played a large role in Gi-hoon's difficulty finding another job. And if you want to argue he should have just sucked it up and gotten another job anyway, well, first off, he did, he's a chauffeur, but I'd also say you're underestimating how severely this event would impact someone's mental health. Gi-hoon's backstory is a direct reference to the real-life strike of SsangYong Motor employees in 2009, who were protesting the layoff of more than 2,000 employees. Their strike was met with fierce brutality by the corporation and law enforcement, and the strikers' efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. This really should have been at least mentioned in Sean's review, since he's critiquing the character and the show's portrayal of capitalism. He even cites sources that mention this specific event. This is one of the few things in the show that wasn't exaggerated. The strike happened exactly as described. Even the death they mentioned really happened. And if you look into it further, you'll see the consequences get much worse. Sean says Squid Game paints a distorted image of humanity, but I found that Gi-hoon was an extremely positive and ultimately inspiring character. His biggest flaws are that he's naive and short-sighted, and the people closest to him suffer as a result. The reason he rejoins the games after learning their true nature is so that he can correct those mistakes. He's not just in it for himself. And through the games, we see that he's a very compassionate person who wants the best outcome for everyone. He immediately builds alliances with contestants deemed worthless by others in the competition. He believes solidarity triumphs over self-interest. In a simpler story, this moral quality would allow Gi-hun to overcome all of the challenges and find a happy ending. But part of what makes Squid Game good is that it doesn't take the easy way out. Gi-hun's compassion is ultimately used against him when he teams up with an old man with the intention of helping him, only to find out that they will compete against each other. He's then driven into a corner when he realizes the only way he can win is by exploiting the old man's dementia. There is the heart of the capitalism critique that Sean missed. Much like in the real world, Gi-hun's belief in solidarity is punished as the people in power exploit his team's unified front and force them to survive as self-interested competitors. In the Sangyang motor strike, employees described how their friends and coworkers were turned into enemies. Former striker Lee Chang-kun writes, "We first attempted to turn to each other to survive together. However, we were thrown into a life-or-death situation, often with no other option but to betray and dupe each other. At least once, as in Squid Game, we each had to hurt our closest friends. By the time the police raided the strike, there were only about 700 of us left, and mistrust of our coworkers nearly outweighed our trust." Gi-hun's arc is one of resilience against these forces. By the end of the games, he is so disgusted with the system that he refuses to kill the last contestant, potentially throwing everything away because he refuses to succeed at the expense of others. Nonetheless, we stood against government brutality and never abandoned our principle of stay alive by sticking together. This was why I felt thankful as I watched Gi-hun, the protagonist based on many aspects of our real lives, showing human dignity and demonstrating altruism. Gosh, that sure seems like an unlikable character who contributes nothing to society. Contrary to what Sean claims, this isn't a story about greed. No one joins the games just for personal gain. Even the most amoral competitors are there because they need the money.
107번 김미영 채무 5억 4천, 118번 오영욱 채무 10억 2천만 원, 322번 정민태 채무 8억 8천, 119번 노상원 채무 13억 9천, 369번 박주원 채무 9억.
One of the only competitors Sean expresses sympathy for is a North Korean defector. And you probably already know where this is going. The typical conservative response to South Korea's anti-capitalist activism is, "Hey, what? Did you forget about North Korea? Look at how horrible they are. Oh my gosh, nothing is more evil than this."
A lot of reviewers seem to believe that Squid Game is some kind of a dunk on what they call late-stage capitalism. Even the North Korean government, impressive beacon of wealth and freedom that it is, announced its approval of Squid Game's supposedly anti-capitalist commentary. But prominent screen time goes to a character who barely escaped North Korea with her life. Her father was shot and killed trying to defect, and her whole motivation for participating in the games is to get enough money to support her little brother and rescue her mom, who's still stuck on the wrong side of the border. Squid Game certainly doesn't make North Korea's brand of totalitarian communism look very fun.
We're just going to ignore that communist comment because I don't have time to explain how wrong that is. What's important is that, as Sean himself points out, Squid Game is clearly not here to say anything good about North Korea. But the right can't seem to wrap its head around the idea that two bad situations can happen at the same time. Like, if a hurricane and fire were happening in two places simultaneously, and someone said, "Gosh, this hurricane sucks," by their logic, the response should be, "What? Are you trying to say this fire is better? Why don't you try burning to death, you son of a bitch?" When Sean and other commentators do this, they're distracting from what Squid Game is trying to say. This character's struggle with debt and family separation after defecting isn't unusual. The brokers who help Northerners escape charge a fortune, and many defectors are saddled with debt as soon as they step out of the country. Once they arrive in the South, they face heavy discrimination and are often suspected of being spies. And this makes it very difficult to find a job, especially if they want to do anything beyond entry-level stuff. Again, taking note of these things does not excuse the problems of the North. Obviously, they want to twist Squid Game to their benefit because the country is a giant propaganda machine. They want you to think that the situation is black and white. It works for their narrative. By scapegoating the North to avoid Squid Game's critiques, Sean and these other commentators are playing right into their hands. Anyway, Sean uses this segue as an opportunity to read the love letter he wrote to capitalism.
At its core, capitalism is simply the private, that is, non-government, ownership of what we might call the means of production. Put a little more accurately, it's an economic system.
Oh lord, he's pulling up the dictionary. Alright, let's just skip ahead a bit here.
An even more important aspect of capitalism is its association with free enterprise or free markets. Historically, what we now call capitalism was a deliberate rejection of top-down economic systems, coinciding with the rise of liberalism and the philosophy of individual rights. For the first time, it allowed producers and consumers to choose whether or not to interact with each other based on their own subjective evaluation of the costs and benefits of the proposed exchange in an open competitive market, instead of being forced to do whatever government officials or violent warlords commanded them to do. That's a good thing.
Right now you might be asking, is Sean going to address any of the show's commentary on capitalism? And the answer is no. No, he isn't. When players are first recruited into Squid Game, they aren't told that the losers will be killed. After watching hundreds of people die in the first game, they are given the opportunity to vote to continue the games or quit and go home. In a very close race, they ultimately decide to leave. However, as some contestants pointed out during the vote, there's nothing waiting for them on the outside. They were selected for these games because they're desperate, and there's no way to turn their lives around without the prize money. The bulk of episode 2 is spent watching our main cast confront their problems on the outside and come to the conclusion that the games are the best opportunity they're going to get. It's an interesting narrative decision that illustrates the illusion of choice under capitalism. You can't blame the games for what happens next. You chose this. Not everyone will succeed, but you might. And doesn't that mean that you deserve it? All the other contestants agreed to this, so if something bad happens to them, it's their fault. It's powerful, scathing commentary that comes from a country with a severe income inequality problem. And Sean's response was, clearly no one here has looked up capitalism in the dictionary. His description of the free market is painfully simplistic, presenting a scenario where ethical, hardworking businesses will always rise to the top.
Yes, entrepreneurs compete with each other in market economies, but it's to see who's best at providing for the needs and desires of their customers. And we're all rewarded with better standards of living. Far from being exploitative, capitalism as a system harnesses humans' natural self-interest in a way that makes serving your fellow man an essential requirement for success.
You almost have to admire that optimism, competing to see who's best at providing for their customers. Right.
Okay, let's do it. On 3. 1, 2, 3. For the customer!
Do internet service providers spend hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying for our benefit, or to prevent the rollout of government-funded high-speed broadband services? Did Johnson & Johnson serve their fellow man when they knowingly poisoned people with asbestos? I'm sure they suffered some real consequences, though. The free market will see to them. It's not like everyone who starts a business is some money-hungry monster. There are plenty of well-intentioned people who want to do right by their customers, but these aren't the ones dominating the free market. Big businesses are managed by dozens of different interests. The primary customer is the shareholder, and their only concern is seeing a return on their investment. Serving the consumer is only a means to that end. Capitalism teaches us to only help others insofar as they can support our own success. And Sean tries to defend this mentality by claiming we'll all benefit in the long run.
Countries which have successfully adopted most of these principles have seen dramatic increases in their standards of living, personal incomes, public health, and environmental quality, and they consistently outperform less free economies across every measurable metric for quality of life.
This is another simplistic overview that neglects obvious problems. Quality of life in capitalist countries is far from stable. It's highly vulnerable to market crashes and recession, and for whatever brief periods of stability it achieves, prolonged periods of mass unemployment, poverty, and homelessness are all but guaranteed. The SsangYong motor strike was sparked by layoffs resulting from the company filing for bankruptcy, which is no surprise. During that time, the global economy was in a recession that stemmed from the bursting of the US housing bubble in 2007. It was a time of severe instability that analysts say would have been avoidable if the government had done more to regulate financial institutions, something that Sean would have opposed because he believes capitalists should be free of any government supervision. Even if we accept his premise that people in capitalist countries are better off, it's not the result of hard work and good values. It's because of unchecked exploitation. Nothing demonstrates this better than the situation in the global south. For decades now, the world's richest countries have drained the south of resources to line their own pockets. One study calculated that the global north took $62 trillion worth of resources between 1960 and 2018. Adjusting for lost growth potential, the total comes to $152 trillion, enough money to end extreme poverty 15 times over. Exploiting the global south is so profitable that it has outpaced economic growth in the north and ratios financial aid sent to these countries 14-1.
That's a good thing.
This is just the start of it. You could spend weeks researching all the ways that capitalist prosperity is a facade. Sean tries to paint South Korea as a beacon of capitalist success, but this is one of the countries suffering from it the most. South Korea's economy depends on corporate conglomerates owned by a handful of wealthy families. These people are so important to the country's prosperity that they can skirt punishment even when convicted of criminal activity. Meanwhile, severe inequality has left the lower classes living on a thin line. At one point in his review, Sean scoffs at a scene where contestants compare unemployment to getting shot at.
One of the most offensive moments in the show, for me, was when a bunch of people compared the difficulty of finding a job to being shot at by mass murderers and watching 50% of the people around you die every day. What?
Yeah, sounds pretty bad when you frame it like that, but if he had looked into it just a little further, he might not have found it so ridiculous. Looking at Lee's article again, he writes, "The country's weak social safety net makes a layoff nearly a death sentence. If workers can't hang on to what they have, they will begin a vertical freefall. This is bankruptcy in its fullest sense, socially and financially." Comparing job loss to death by dictatorship sounds outrageous on the surface, but in a situation like the one Lee describes, the outcomes aren't too different. One is immediately horrifying, while the other is a slow, painful death that most people won't even consider a tragedy, because they're conditioned to believe that people in poverty are at fault for their own situation. Why? Because
he doesn't do anything remotely productive. He doesn't even try to create value for anybody.
Honestly, that was the line that convinced me to make this video. It's one of the most abhorrent and callous beliefs drilled into people living in capitalism. You can't even totally blame Sean for thinking it. This is what we're taught as children. Like I said earlier, capitalism trains us to consider a person's value based only on what they can offer us. We see this in the games with women and the elderly getting left out when picking teams because people assume young, fit males will have an advantage. An obvious parallel to real-life hiring discrimination. But the extension of that thinking is that we aren't of any value if we aren't productive. And in a profit-driven society, productivity means contributing to the bottom line. So no matter what your circumstances, if you can't work or support someone who does, you will be made to feel worthless. You have nothing to offer society or the people you love.
죄송한데요. 제가 지금 누굴 도울 수 있는 처지가 아닙니다.
This is a big part of the horror behind Squid Game. It turns this outrageous idea into something that feels like it could actually happen. Gi-hoon was a hard worker who fought unjust termination for himself and his co-workers, and it destroyed his life. Why not risk everything in a stupid, dangerous game? At least it's an opportunity. Sean isn't totally ignorant of capitalism's problems, but he weakly tries to shift the blame to cronyism. I'm going to spare you the clip because I assume you've heard this argument before. If the market were truly free, then we'd have no problems. The corrupt oligarchs would have no choice but to play fair. Putting aside how naive that is, the scenario of a totally free market is not even feasible. In a large-scale economy, there will always be a need for regulation, oversight, and enforcement. Markets cannot govern everything by themselves, and even if they could, they shouldn't, because that would be terrifying. It would be a world where corporations run everything, and that's a fucking nightmare. That's not to say the government is awesome and should have ultimate control. My point is that unchecked power always leads to corruption, and we need a better system of regulation. Anyway, that covers just about everything in Sean's video. But before we end, I want to talk about one of his primary reasons for disliking Squid Game.
I don't think it's particularly healthy to spend 9 hours wallowing in misery and human suffering. Shows like this reinforce viewers' worst assumptions and beliefs about other people, and in this case, Squid Game paints a very distorted picture of the world.
This is very telling to me. The way Sean talks about this show, it was just bad people doing bad things, living in a world that is unrealistically pessimistic and cruel. I mean, no wonder he didn't enjoy it. That sounds miserable. But that's not what Squid Game is. The game's contestants aren't bad or good. They're just people dealing with very real and understandable problems. It's a story about how capitalist principles force desperate people to turn against each other. It doesn't want us to think people are evil. In fact, it's the opposite. It asks us to look at things from a new perspective, to empathize with people who live different lives and face different challenges. It begs us to consider why we're okay with a system where some get to win at the expense of so many who lose. While everyone is responsible for their actions, they're not responsible for their circumstances. So even as we condemn Squid Game's more amoral characters, we're still left with a degree of sympathy and understanding. This pushes us to consider what can be done systemically to help people live better lives free of desperation, inferiority, and recklessness. And when you trace the dots to see where everything goes wrong, you'll find it always leads back to the same problem. So that's all I have to say on this. If you got something useful out of this video and think others could too, give it a like, leave a comment, and consider subscribing. And if you really like my stuff and want to see more, you can support me on Patreon. I don't post videos very often, but I am always actively working on them, so your support is appreciated. Until then, thanks to my current patrons, and see you guys later.